first question. And it's for, my question's for Mr. Walker. You kept saying we can look at the facts and make up our own minds. But I don't quite know how to make sense of the facts. So let me ask you the big picture. When you step back and you look at that big red blotch, which is the Barnett Shale, does that represent a health threat to my 3-year-old daughter? Right now, should I be worried about the air she's breathing in or not?
Well, I'm gonna address one issue you raised first, just to make sure that I didn't mislead you, and I think I covered it in the presentation. When I say I want to make sure give you the information to draw your own conclusions, I am not at all saying that I'm not going to be available, my staff are not going to be available to help you go through that information and answer questions as we go along. What I am saying is I want to make sure that without trying to put a slant on that, without trying to bias the information one way or the other, I want you to have the facts. And then as a person who has those facts, you can draw conclusions. Now, trying to answer your question, when I look at those red dots, I see a lot of wells. But in my mind, I also know that in this ambient air shed, in the Tarrant, Dallas County areas, there's a lot of gas stations. There's a lot of industry. In Midlothian, there are companies. And as a person whose primary responsibility is ensuring that the air quality is getting better here in DFW, what I want to be able to look at is an overall picture of what that air quality looks like. And what I'm seeing, especially as it relates to some of those areas that we have been forced to look at related to ozone, which includes VOCs, is that our air quality is getting better. And it has been getting better. Have we reached our attainment goals? No. But when I look at the air quality in the North Central Texas area, I've seen an air quality that's been constantly proven, even though we've increased in vehicle miles traveled. I mean, we have congested highways, we have many more vehicles on those highways than we've had before. We have 2 counties within the Dallas-Fort Worth area that have over 1.5 million people. And I've seen the air quality get better. And I've seen that happen at the same time that oil and gas activity is going up.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me get to the questions from the audience. Okay, this one's for Mr. Ewing, Devon Energy. Are there any communities on the Barnett Shale that your company chooses not to drill in, specifically because of their local ordinances or regulations?
That, I showed the one map earlier, had all the yellow spaces in that, and those were leases that were taken several years ago. And with the success the industry has had, there's a lot of companies that have come in and leased a lot of the area. So to answer your question, we haven't intentionally avoided any particular towns because of their regulations. Some of it has been from the standpoint, from a geological standpoint, from our evaluation, they're actually in places that we haven't had much success. So we haven't had a big desire to get into those towns. So to answer your question, we don't specifically avoid because of regulations. In the case where there are issues with regulations, then we want to, as we're trying to do here, work with the city so the regulations make sense, that we're meeting the goal of the regulations, and the primary goal of regulations is to protect health and welfare of their citizens. So in most of these towns, Devon has over 500 employees. It's what Mr. Gwynn alluded to here. I grew up in this area, in the Barnett area. My family's being raised here. We want to protect the environment as much as anybody else does.
Okay, thanks. Next one's probably for Mr. Tintera, but maybe others could weigh in. Since the drilling industry appears to be incapable of preventing gas emissions, to what extent can cities use public health powers to regulate wellheads? I'm trying to minimize my editorializing on these, but I think generally we're trying to get at what kind of powers do cities have in the regulatory scope of things? If they're concerned about public health, how much can that play into what cities can do?
And there'll be a 2-part answer to this. I'll answer Railroad Commission part of it, but then I will have to ask the TCEQ to answer some other air emissions portions of this thing. But the first part of it, the roles of the cities and the responsibilities of the cities really depends on your charter. It depends on how the city was first formed. and what authorities was given to the city fathers as to how much control or how many authorities you can have. I will say this, a city cannot have wells drilled within the city limits, for example, that do not have a Railroad Commission permit. So you can't violate the Railroad Commission permitting activities. Whether you want to have other activities that involve some sort of setbacks that currently don't exist in the Railroad Commission, or other activities. I've seen cities like Fort Worth take those in and set models of how they approach that. That's done by the elected local officials and their local decisions. Now, as far as the emissions part of it, perhaps TCEQ would like to answer that.
Well, we can attempt to. I mean, when you specifically talked about the wellhead, and one of the things I may have not covered on that, and when we talked about some of the differences in our rules now versus what they were a year ago. Prior to this rule change, we did not have jurisdiction at all, or permitting authority at all, over the wellhead itself. Our permitting process started at the first downstream piece of equipment. Now we at least have the authority to have that facility registered, but it's still a de minimis source when it talks about the pollution coming from that wellhead. And what that means is that the wellhead itself, once you frack and produce that well, the expectation is you're going to have very little emissions coming from the wellhead. And so, that being the case, there is not a real potential for emissions coming off of that source. Now, things that don't have an authorization, TCEQ still has that rule not being able to create a nuisance. So if there were a situation at that wellhead where a nuisance was created and we could document that, we would investigate it and try to bring them into compliance with that. But as an authorization, we don't provide an authorization for emissions from the wellhead. There's nothing expected coming from there.
Can I just weigh in for just a second? First off, that wellhead is designed to prevent any emissions. We're an oil and gas company. We're in the business to sell our gas. We don't want to have emissions. We don't want to lose emissions. We don't want to lose that gas because that's what makes us tick. I think Mr. Walker may be able to confirm, but where we've had emissions issues around a wellhead, it's usually a mechanical failure or a mechanical problem that just needs to be addressed. So.
And to finally add in, I'd like to perhaps ask Walter to respond to this part of how we enforce our venting rules and our flaring rules. Oil and gas is allowed by rule for a short time, vent or flare gas. Flaring significantly reduces the contaminants in the natural gas, as well as any of the explosive rich with it. If we find a leaking gas well, Walter, how do you address it?
Well, we will contact the operator immediately, determine what the problem is. We get someone out there. If it is a mechanical failure that we can get corrected immediately, that's going to happen right away. If it's a situation where they are venting gas and it's within the guidelines that the parameters that are set out already by rule that allow some venting to occur, then we're going to take a look at that and see what potential imminent danger there is to the surrounding environment and health and safety of everybody around there. Number one, we don't want any gas escaping that's going to go in somebody's house or neighborhood. We're not going to allow that. We would not allow any venting of that sort of nature. The operator doesn't want it either. They don't want that sort of safety failure on their hands. So everybody really is going to jump to it. So we ensure that if they need to vent gas, that it's going to be flared so as to not escape and pool in an area that would create a hazard.
Our Railroad Commission rules do require that the wellhead have integrity, that the wellhead not be leaking, whether it is fluid or gas. So that portion of it, apart from the air emissions and the air quality portion of it, that part of it does fall into the Railroad Commission's purview, and we can force an operator or take other actions for an operator to make sure those wells are in good repair.
I'm sorry, does the Railroad Commission watch over compressor stations also?
Yeah, let me add, because I think the question isn't so much about the wellhead, the technical, it's about emissions. So a lot of my understanding is a lot of the gases that come up, like even in the initial flowback stage, and they get into these these condensate tanks, say, that they could volatilize, and you might have just gases just coming off, right? And so one of the questions we had, people asking, why is it that you use vapor recovery in some areas but not other areas? And so the concern is maybe not the wellhead specifically, but other parts of the production facility that might have volatilizing emissions coming off of it. Yeah,
Well,
if that's what kind of,
and I misunderstood your question, because I thought you were talking specifically about the wellhead.
yeah.
When I say that TCEQ picks up the emission sources downstream, that includes the tanks, that includes the condensate, the compressor engines, that basically includes all the other components related to oil and gas activity that would have the potential to emit. We would have the jurisdiction over that. As I'm recalling your question, I think your question was about the city having the ability to write in their ordinances things about, could you restate that for me?
Yeah.
Just to make sure.
To what extent can cities use public health powers to regulate wellheads? I'm not sure quite what that means, but
And that's, when I hear that question, and I've been a part of some of the process where cities have been sitting down and talking about revamping their ordinances. And I don't know the answer to this question, so I'm going to start off by telling you that we tried to ask that question. Cities have asked it, and we put them in touch with our legal staff, because I think that goes to the backdrop of the Clean Air Act. And in the Clean Air Act, it talks about not being able to be more protective than, or more restrictive than the act itself, or the agency that has jurisdiction over the act. In the state of Texas, that's going to be the TCEQ. So I think what that question is about is, can the city in its ordinance writing be more restrictive than the state if it focuses on public health?
yes.
And I think that's a question that we put before, that has been put before our attorneys. I think the issue is whether or not it's Clean Air Act, is it guided by the Clean Air Act, or is it guided by public health? And unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. But I think that's what the question is. That's what that question
Good,
is.
that helps to clarify, I think. And that brings up the next question, actually, is isn't it the case, I've heard this Halliburton loophole, that a lot of the oil and gas industry is exempt from the Clean Air Act, or is that not true? So can you help clarify that, of course?
No. I can say that the regulations that we've had on the books before now, and the regulations that have been recently revised, are directly related to oil and gas. And so they are not exempt for the regulations that we just put in place for them.
Okay. Thanks. Now we've got another one. This is probably from Mr. Tentera. Something I've been wondering too. If surface property and mineral property are owned by different individuals, and the mineral owner wants to drill his minerals, how does one do that without the surface owner's permission? Why should he have to protest? And shouldn't the mineral owner, and wouldn't the mineral owner impose on the surface owner's rights?
First of all, that is a decision that was made by the civil courts of Texas, and the statutes of Texas reflect that. And that is that the mineral rights predominate. That's the legal word that's used, predominate over the surface rights. And the person that owns the mineral rights has a legal right to extract those mineral rights. Now, their civil suits are frequently common where surface owner believes someone who is owning the minerals tears down their fences, lets their horses loose. Some other associated cuts down trees that they shouldn't have cut down. Those aren't the jurisdiction of the Railroad Commission. Those need to be addressed in civil courts through civil suits or through private contract negotiations with operators like Devon, when they come up and say, we own the mineral rights, you own the surface, and this is what we want to do to your property. These are the damages that we see, and then a price is negotiated. None of this falls under Railroad Commission jurisdiction.
Interesting. Okay. This one I like because it's stepping back the big picture here. Texas can generate a lot of wind power. Why don't we just build more wind farms and stop drilling?
Okay.
All of you could maybe.
Yeah, I'll certainly be happy to do that. Texas is the #1 producer of wind energy. Wind energy sometimes plays several percentages, 5, 6, 8% of the energy that Texas uses. I've sat through hearings with wind energy where Air Force bases were saying we cannot have wind farms on the coast near our Air Force base because it disturbs our radar. So they have their own siting restrictions. Currently, the siting of wind farms is not regulated by any entity that I'm aware of. It's totally a private contractual matter for wind farms. The infrastructure for it and the varieties of wind farm energy makes them an excellent source of apparently adding to the energy resources available to Texas. But the base that's necessary on a daily basis primarily comes to the power plants from lignite and from natural gas or from oil. And as you know, we do have at least one nuclear power plant in Texas.
I'd like to just add in on that. I think wind is an important part of our future from a state standpoint or from a nation standpoint for energy. But what you got to remember is all the many different things that natural gas and the byproducts of natural gas go into for manufacturing of plastics, of synthetics. I mean, the list is enormous. So the thought that you can eliminate the need for that natural resource is somewhat limited because it goes into so many other things other than just providing electricity.
Final comment on wind energy, and it's not necessarily the siting of the actual windmill locations, and we've all seen them if we've driven up to the Abilene area. It's a very magnificent, impressive site. But from every single one of those, there must be power lines. And those power lines must traverse vast parts of the state. And to get those power lines to traverse the state, they must go through private property. So they go through some of the similar hearings and some of the similar challenges at the Public Utilities Commission, who I would also recommend you contact with this question, to get the rights of way to extend the very large and extensive power lines across the state. And those hearings can be very time-consuming and somewhat controversial.
Okay. Next question, I think, is for Mr. Walker, probably, and I think this is referring to a scene out of Gasland. Alfonso Armendariz talks about a study that SMU conducted. So the question is, what do you have to say in response to an SMU study that shows that the methane released from Barnett Shale gas compression stations is equivalent to all the pollution from Fort Worth traffic?
I am familiar with the study, and in my familiarity with the study, I don't recall that being what he assessed. He did state that when you talk about the NOx emissions and the VOC emissions from traffic, that the NOx emissions and the VOC emissions associated with oil and gas were about equivalent. I don't think that statement was about methane. I think it was about NOx and VOC emissions. And I don't know that I dispute that information. I know that when you talk about the Barnett Shale play and the DFW non-attainment area, they're not the same things. And that's what I alluded to on the second slide. When you talk about the DFW non-attainment area, it's basically Dallas, Tarrant, Denton, Collin County, and then those 5 counties surrounding it. When you talk about the Barnett Shale, it's the 24 counties with Wise, Johnson, Denton, and Tarrant County as their core, kind of moving northwest. So one, they're not apples to apples, they're not the same area. So the Barnett Shale and the emissions associated with it is not the same area that has the emissions from the vehicles. And then when you talk about the emissions, the makeup is not the same. It's not a makeup of the same amount of VOCs and the same amount of NOx as you have in oil and gas. It's taking both of those categories and putting it together and saying they're both the same. But again, it's not, the geographical area is not the same.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, this one's for Mr. Ewing. When looking at where to drill, I see seismic effect on production as listed considerations. Also, I see working with the Railroad Commission permitting. What about proximity to homes or schools? Is that purely for the jurisdictions to consider or impose on you? Or is there some internal consideration at Devon of these concerns?
The proximity to school structures or anything, yeah, absolutely. It's of concern to Devon, and we will, if we're in the rural country, we're gonna look at where homes are, and that was one of the points. I may not have made a good point of it, but the first step in that process is putting the stake in the ground. We've got geologists and we've got engineers deciding, okay, they're looking at a map and saying, okay, the best way I can develop this area, this 400 acres, is if I put a well here, well here, well here, and what we have guys on the ground that will go out, work with the surveyors, get the stakes in the ground, and the first thing they're going to look at, okay, is this a doable situation? Where are we in proximity to homes and so on and so forth? So, yes, when we get into the city of Denton or get into the city of Ponder, we're going to meet those regulations. They can set those regulations. Railroad Commission does not set those regulations. But we as a company will look where we are and we'll take that into consideration. If we're in close proximity to somebody, we're going to deal with that surface owner. We're going to talk to that surface owner, and we're going to look for options to get away from being too close, if that's a possibility.
Thank you. Next one for Mr. Tintera. When you consider a drilling permit, do you consider the impact on neighborhood health, property values, and quality of life? Have you ever refused a request for a drilling permit, and if so, why? Would these considerations, I guess, weigh into it?
Our statutory authority is to protect the mineral rights and to make sure that the well is properly drilled to protect the groundwater. Our regulatory authority and inspections is to ensure that the well is operated in a safe manner and that there are no spills, or if there are any spills, they're immediately responded to, and that any public health threats are also immediately responded to. That's Walter's job as our district director, to respond to those spill reports. The spill reports are required to be immediately reported to the Railroad Commission by the operators, and we will take operators to enforcement and fine them for not telling us of spills that they're going to have. We take that very seriously. So our regulatory framework for the drilling permits does not address the quality of life. That's a local control issue. Setbacks, visual obstructions, the neighborhood ambiance, those are things that the Railroad Commission does not have authority for. But the public health and safety part of the operation of that well, the Railroad Commission definitely has authority over that and asserts that authority.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up. And so if you said there's a local issue on many of those.
Yes.
And
Local government.
This gets back to what Mr. Walker said he wasn't quite sure on. In some of those instances, local restrictions could be more tough than the state ones, right? So you could have a case where you would have permitted something, but it's trumped by more restrictive local regulations.
Yeah.
Or is that not?
Yes, no, that is a possibility. For example, the city of Fort Worth has its own drilling ordinances. After you get a Railroad Commission permit, an operator would have to go to the city of Fort Worth and get a city of Fort Worth permit also in order to operate. And that city of Fort Worth permit, as long as it doesn't violate the Railroad Commission rules, for example, they can't issue them without a Railroad Commission drilling permit. Right. Okay, well, you've got to have one of those. Can adjust the operator's approach to developing the field. They can set that local control. Okay. And that really goes again back to what I said. It depends how your city, town, or regulated community has been chartered, has been set up. You'll have to ask your city attorneys whether, for example, City of Denton has that authority.
All right, thanks. There were, got maybe one or two more questions, and there were lots on issues of water, so I want to at least get one of those in. Here's one. How can our government allow the oil and gas industry to take 3 to 7 million gallons of our natural resources, our water, from the people forever? That's an illegal taking.
Okay, I am going to assume that when they say forever, okay, they're talking about waste disposal activities.
Probably ground deep water.
Yeah, deep water injection. And that's water that has been used and for some reason has been converted to water that is no longer potable. And that is injected under very special conditions into specially permitted reservoirs with specially constructed wells under special permits and closely monitored and reported to the Railroad Commission. And we have a very large program of that. Now, another part of that might be some comments that I've heard and from some officials that I've been surprised they'd say it, is saying, well, if you use fresh water and turn that into non-potable water and then inject it deep, that is no longer part of the hydrologic cycle. And as a geologist, I have some serious questions about that, about the way that science is being portrayed. The hydrologic cycle is huge. It's a gigantic cycle. whether you talk about it globally, continentally, or just in Texas, it's still a gigantic cycle. And the very small amounts of water that is converted into non-potable water and not recycled, and by the way, the Railroad Commission has numerous recycling regulations, encourages recycling, and has 5 or 6 permits right now to recycle frac water. And those are active in the field, and Devon does a significant amount of that recycling so they can reuse that frac water. But to make the allegation that that is lost forever without taking into account the overall hydrologic cycle, where, for example, in the Ogallala Aquifer, groundwater is being mined right now, it's not being recharged, that's being added, okay, to the hydrologic cycle, is using a partially scientific argument to try to make a point. And that point, I believe, I question its veracity as a geologist. This is a personal geologist. You are always going to have some type of waste that's deep injected. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality handles hazardous waste that's deeply injected, Class 1 waste as it's called. The Railroad Commission handles Class 2, oil field waste that's deeply injected. Virtually every industry comes up with some type of waste, and virtually every industry is removing some sort of material from some natural cycle in order to better the economy, the jobs, the civilization, whatever it is of the economy to move progress ahead. So to use that argument solely against the oil and gas industry and to say that that's lost forever to the hydrologic cycle, I think is a very partial explanation of the true science behind it.
Let me address from the industry perspective, and that's my daily work is acquiring water. And let me clarify, we as an industry, or we as Devon, the water rights, whether it's groundwater or surface water, and I'll clarify here in a minute before I get too deep into this, belongs to that surface owner. So for Devon to use groundwater, unless it was specifically stated in the lease that we have access to the groundwater, and most of 90% of new leases don't allow that, but we have to negotiate with that surface owner to gain access to that groundwater. Now, I think Denton has a newly created groundwater district. Wise has had one for a couple of years now. They do regulate. We do have to meet their regulations on placement of water wells, how close they can be. We get to surface water. If it's in a waterway, then TCEQ has authority over it. I have to go to them and get a permit. And because of the drought, they're not issuing permits. From the lakes, we have to go to that governing authority. So it's just not, we can go out and secure whatever water we want. We still, in every instance, have to gain authority from whoever the governing body is over water to gain access to it.
And I know you had those questions, I'm sure you had it before. I put that slide up, but that's what I wanted to point out there. When you start talking about water sourcing, if that question is directed towards the state about limiting that ability to get to that water, many of the sources don't require state approval to get that water. It's a contractual relationship between the owner of the water and the industry.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. I said I'd wrap this up at 9:15, and it's 9:15. So please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you all. And don't forget about next week's